evening, everybody. I'm Major General Hemant Kumar Singh from the Military Literature and Cultural Festival Foundation. I welcome you all to this second session of the Military Literature Festival Lucknow. A special welcome to our revered guest speakers, Dr. Rosie Llewellyn Jones from the United Kingdom, Lieutenant General Milan Naidu from Bhopal, and Ms. Mehru Jaffer from Lucknow. Ms. Jaffer will be the moderator for the day to converse on the two deeply researched books. These are fascinating books, Lucknow 1857 and Nizaam-e-Awad. We call the session Different Strokes. So much can be spoken about Mehru Jaffer. I'll highlight just a few things. Mehru Jaffer is an author and a journalist. She has taught Islam and gender-related topics at the University of Vienna and Vienna American Webster University. She is the author of the book on Muhammad, the book on Muhyiddin Chishti, the book of Nizamuddin Aulia, all published by Penguin, and Love and Life in Lucknow, published by Niyogi, and her latest release is A Shadow of the Past, a short biography of Lucknow, published by the Alfie Book Company. Mehru has filed extensively for the Indian media from Europe and Indonesia, including television and reporting for the BBC. She made Vienna is So Bolly, a 1-minute film on the fascination for Bollywood in Vienna. She also made a 50-minute film on Shah Rukh Khan called Mr. Khan, Vienna Loves You. Mehru has also moderated a workshop on song and dance in the Indian cinema at the same university. She did a master's in English literature from Lucknow University and now lives in Lucknow. Her forthcoming book is on Urdu poets of the 19th century. Over to you, Ms. Mehru Jaffer.
Thank you so much, Hemantji. A very, very good evening to everyone, and thank you for being here on a festival. Hope all of you did your duty today of tying the Rakhi and promising to take care of not just your own sisters, but all the women of this country. It's an absolute honor to be part of Lucknow's first military literature festival. Although I know nothing about military affairs and only just a little bit more about literature, but I do look forward to an interesting conversation this evening. I look forward to learning more about the military from General Milan Naidu, who's one of our two guests today, and more about the 1857 battle in Lucknow from Rosie. It is for me a fan moment to introduce to you Dr. Rosie Llewellyn Jones, MBE, member of the Order of the British Empire. Rosie permits us to address her as Rosie. So Rosie, welcome from faraway London. I don't know if I should add a warm welcome to you as you are in the midst, I believe, of a heat wave. Is that correct?
No.
The
heat wave is gone.
So it's cooled down there. Therefore, a very, very warm welcome. What I will add here is that it is Rosie who chose the time and date to talk to us today, as it is the full moon, she said. So maybe at some stage, Rosie, do explain to us what a full moon night means to you. Why is it so special for you? For those of you who may not be familiar with Rosie's work, Rosie studied Urdu and Hindi at London School of Oriental Studies. She was awarded a first class, actually it's London School of Oriental and African Studies. She was awarded a first class honors degree and completed her PhD in 1980. The PhD was later published in 1985 and is the best-selling book called A Fatal Friendship, the Nawabs, the British, and the city of Lucknow. This is a book from which I learned a lot about my own city. Rosie has also written a trilogy on Major General Claude Martin, founder of La Martiniere schools in India and in France. And she is an honorary old Martinian. There is a book on Murshidabad, the forgotten capital of Bengal, by Rosie as well, written along with Dr. Neeta Das. A grand book on portraits in princely India and the Great Uprising in India, 1857-1858. Very curious to know, Rosie, what is in your latest book on 1857, which is not already mentioned in your earlier book on the same uprising. Rosie's biography of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, the last king in India, published in 2014, was a critical success in Britain and in India. A lot of people still want to know why Wajid Ali Shah, the Nawab, is the last king in India. Maybe you would like to explain that as well, why you call him the last king. She has recently completed a book now, 1857, for HarperCollins India, to be published later this year, about which she will tell us more today. Rosie visits the subcontinent as frequently as possible, to the delight of all those who know her. She has many friends in Lucknow, but one of her best friends was the late Ram Advani. Rosie was an invited speaker at a recent Jaipur Literature Festival. Until recently, she was the archivist at the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, London, and a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society. She was awarded the MBE in 2015 for services to the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia and for British Indian Studies. Delighted, absolutely delighted to have Rosie with us this evening as we wait for the full moon to light up the sky later tonight. We have General Milan Naidu, who joins us from Bhopal. Most welcome, sir, and a salute to you.
Thank you.
General Naidu will talk to us about Nizaam-e-Bhopal, his fascinating documentation of a historical account of the militaries of the Bhopal state. It is also interesting to know that a Telugu-speaking Naidu family continues to happily live in the midst of a mixed population of Pindaris, Marathas, Rajputs, Bhils, Gonds, and Afghan warriors in Bhopal. General Naidu was commissioned to the Rajput regiment in 1967 after his schooling in Bhopal. He spent 41 years in the army. He graduated from the Canadian Forces Staff College, Toronto. He was an instructor at the Infantry School and Indian Military Academy. He commanded the 5th Battalion, the Rajput Regiment, in Sri Lanka. He was appointed military attaché in Germany, Guten Abend, General. He commanded a division as part of a strike corps, the corps in Ladakh. The general was Commandant Army War College and later General Officer, Commanding in Chief of the Army Training Command. He went on to be the Vice Chief of Army Staff. General Naidu retired in 2008, but was appointed member of the Armed Forces Tribunal, New Delhi. And finally, he retired in December 2013. I hope his next project is on the time he spent in Sri Lanka as commander of the 5th Battalion of the Rajput Regiment. As readers, we wait to enjoy that account documented by him in his inimitable style, which is witnessed in Nizaam-e-Bhopal. While going through Nizaam-e-Bhopal, what I could not help noting is the near absence of religion as a reason for engaging in various battles and skirmishes. What was more at stake, it seems, in the battles that we read about in Nizaam-e-Bhopal, for the warriors, what was more important was survival for the warriors, the need of warriors and conquerors for more wealth and territory. It seems the reason for going to battle were less heavenly and less to do with God and more to do with wealth and territory, or the desire of warriors perhaps and conquerors to want to strengthen their political power and to add to their wealth, even if it meant making alliances with warriors professing a different religion, and the annihilation of even close family members if they were to benefit politically and economically. Therefore, my question to both of you is if you found during your own research and scholarship that religion is not necessarily responsible for every battle, invasion, and conquest. What are the other reasons that people battle over? However, before the guests take up this question, let me invite Rosie to first talk about her yet unreleased book, Lucknow 1857, along with a PowerPoint presentation. So now over to you, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Mehru, and thank you for inviting me. I'm honored and privileged to be with so many distinguished people. It's a great honor for me.
Lovely.
And just to tell you about the MBE, Member of the British Empire, I thought this was quite ironic. I've spent almost my entire career criticizing the British Empire, and then they make me a member of it. I mean, how British can you be? And also, while we're just waiting for the PowerPoint presentation to come up, you'd asked about the last king in India, and this was a deliberate title because Wajid Ali Shah's ancestors were given the title of king by the East India Company. In fact, the company offered it to several other rulers, but Ovid were the only ones who took the opportunity. And therefore, Wajid Ali Shah, the last descendant, was the last king. The title ceased on his death. And it's the English title of king that I was emphasizing.
It was his ancestor called Ghaziuddin Haider.
Yes, that's correct. There was a huge coronation in Lucknow in 1819, a real tamasha. So we can start the PowerPoint presentation now, I think. And what I'm going to do, I'm looking briefly at the events of 1857 in Lucknow.
चेक करना बिजली चेक करने के लिए
That's fine. That's good. Okay. So what I want to do is to talk briefly about the events of 1857 and 1858, but I want to do this very much from the Indian point of view, from the point of view of those opposing the company, because I think we've heard far too much about the British in Lucknow during this period. It sometimes seems that everybody who was in the residency wrote their memoirs as soon as they escaped. I don't want to do this. I want to concentrate on the opposition. And if I call them rebels, this is not derogatory. It simply means somebody rebelling against the order of the East India Company. So I'm going to talk briefly about 15, 20 minutes, no more than that. Thank you. First slide, please. This is absolutely fascinating. It is a flag belonging to Begum Hazrat Mahal. It's in Britain, which is no surprise because most of the loot from Lucknow ended up in Britain. This was seized at some point, probably during 1858. And it's wonderful. It's got all kinds of things. First of all, it's made out of silk. It's beautifully embroidered. And if you look in the center, you can see the chata, the symbol of royalty, and you can see fish, and you can also see two mermaids. And the reason that the fish symbol is so closely associated with Lucknow is that it was a Mughal honor. It's called the Mahi Maratib, and it was an honor bestowed by the Mughal emperor on the first Nawab of Awadh, Burhan ul Mulk. You can actually see it in some paintings from the Padshah-nama, and it's simply two silver fish hanging from a pole. It's always two fish. You can't have a solitary fish. So this is why you have the fish symbol on many, many doorways still in Lucknow. And here you see it. So Begum Hazrat Mahal was the leader, if you like, of the rebels, reluctantly so. She was appointed because her son, Burgess Qadr, was a child, the son of Wajid Ali Shah, who by this point is actually in prison in Fort William in Calcutta. So those opposing the company wanted a figurehead, and they chose this 13-year-old boy, Burgess Qadr. But his mother really took over, and she is the main figurehead. She was an extraordinary woman, plucked from a very, very humble background. In fact, her father was an African slave, so she was mixed blood, but she rose to the occasion. Next slide, please. I wanted to look at some of the defenses that the rebels, those opposing the company, put up. And we tend to think that perhaps it was a walkover for the British to go back in March 1858. It wasn't. It took them 2 weeks of solid fighting to get into the center of Lucknow. And the reason was that once they'd evacuated the residency in November 1857, the townspeople went ahead with building the most extraordinary barricades and ditches. And if you look on the left-hand side of this photograph, you can see that there are planks, wood, doors, all kinds of things stuck into the barricades to make them impenetrable. And this huge trench in front, and you can see how large the trench is. If you look down at the man who's actually standing right at the bottom, that gives you an idea of how vast these works were. And the mosque on the right-hand side is actually still there. It's on the corner of Vijay Sabha Marg. You can hardly see it. It's hidden behind a cinema, but it's still there. And in the center, we can see the old Begum Koti in Hazratganj, which was demolished in the 1980s to make a shopping mall. Next slide, please. This is the Machi Bhawan. You probably know that it means fish house. And again, we're going back to the symbols that were given to the Nawabs of royalty, the Mahamarathi. And you can just about make out the two fish on the central gateway, the arched gateway. And this is important because at one point, the British who were holed up in Lucknow residency wanted to keep both the Machi Bhawan, where the gunpowder was stored, and the residency, but it didn't work out. You can't actually hold two separated places if you're fighting an enemy. So they reluctantly decided to leave the Machi Bhawan. They blew up their arsenal, tremendous explosion. But one of the reasons this is so interesting is you see again the preparations that the townspeople made against the company coming in. They've put everything they can into this. They've bricked up the central arch of the fortress, of the gateway, and it's totally defended. Next, please. This will be familiar to anyone who knows Lucknow. It's the Rumi Darwaza on the left-hand side, and it's the Great Imambara, the mosque of the Great Imambara to the right. And again, this gives you some idea of how fierce the fighting was all along this road, which is now a sort of fairly plain, empty road towards Husainabad, were houses. It's all been fought over, every single inch was fought over. It's difficult sometimes when you're going along Lucknow's fairly wide streets to get any idea of how intense the fighting was, but I think this conveys something of it to you. And again, if you look at the right-hand archway in the Rumi Darwaza itself, just go down a little bit and you can see that's also been blocked up. The idea was to keep the British relieving force in March 1858 out of the city. It didn't work, but it was a huge attempt. And as I said, it actually took the British 2 whole weeks to get into the center of Lucknow, which shows the resistance that the townspeople put up. Next, please. This is interesting because we know where it was. It was in the Chota Manzil, which is one of the riverside palaces, and it shows the results of mining. Now, you might think mining is sort of irrelevant to this kind of warfare, but it isn't. What happened was that the Indian miners would dig tunnels underneath the buildings, and the trick was to know when to set off your mine, that's your gunpowder, so it would do the maximum amount of damage. And quite clearly it has here. This was obviously taken in March 1858, and you can see 2 Europeans and an Indian man behind, but it gives some idea of the devastation and also explains why so many of Lucknow's buildings simply went. They couldn't be rebuilt. We know that Chota Manzil had a very intricate system of passages and little kiosks. When you see it today, it seems like an isolated building. It wasn't all like that. It was part of a huge palace complex. Next slide, please. Thank you. I talked, no, go back, that's it, that's the one. Hang on to that. This was actually painted sometime after the uprising, but it's the best illustration of the looting that went on. I was telling Mehru earlier on that there was an exhibition in Los Angeles over 10 years ago now, and it was called Lucknow, the fabled city of Lucknow, and the idea was to show some of its arts and crafts. It was at the Getty Museum, and the extraordinary thing is not a single exhibit came from Lucknow itself. Can you imagine 3 whole rooms filled with goods from Lucknow, but none actually, go back, none actually from Lucknow itself. And the reason is that there's virtually nothing left in Lucknow. The British actually looted for 2 whole days, and the idea was it was a kind of reward for the soldiers who'd fought so hard to get into the city. It was a way of giving them a holiday, giving them the chance to get hold of some loot. And when we're talking about the recapture of Lucknow, I'm not just talking about the company soldiers, the British soldiers, I'm talking about the Gurkhas, because young Bahadur, who was the ruler of Nepal, actually came along to help. And one of the reasons he came to help was that he wanted his men to have a share in the loot too. So there may be a lot of treasures in Nepal. We don't know, I've never found any, but we certainly know that a huge number came back to Britain. Such treasures that people were able to redeem the mortgages on their country estates. And even today, treasures are still turning up. I will be contacted by someone who says, I've got an interesting painting, and it came from the Kaiserbagh. Lucknow was stripped of many, many of its treasures. Next, please. Thank you. This is quite a well-known photograph. It's by Felice Beato, who was, strangely enough, despite his name, a British subject. He'd been born in a part of the Venetian Empire when part of it was under British rule. But what's interesting about this, it's the Secunderbagh, it's the garden house within the Secunderbagh itself. And people saw what they thought, well, Beato's actually there after one of the battles, but this is not so. because he was there in March 1858 and the battle for Secunderabad had taken place in the previous September, and all of the bodies and the detritus had been cleared away because Colin Campbell made this his headquarters when he came in to relieve Lucknow. There were no bodies at all. So where did they all come from? And the answer is that Beato actually had bodies disinterred to make a more spectacular photograph. And if you look at that ground floor archway on the right-hand side, this is where a number of bodies were stored, covered with earth. So Beato gets the workmen to undo the door, and you can see the bricks down there in front of the doorway to bring out the bodies, which by this point are more or less skeletons, to make a spectacular photograph. So don't tell me that the camera cannot lie, because it certainly has in this case. The only comfort of this really distressing photograph is that after he'd taken his photographs, the dead were taken out and they were buried in a trench in front of Secunderabad. So when you walk along that road, just remember you're walking over the Indian dead. Next, please. And this is interesting. It's obviously after the British have recaptured Lucknow again. It's the Cawnpore Road, just outside the residency. But what is of great interest, and certainly to anyone interested in military history and communications, is that one of the first things the British did when they got back was to re-establish the telegraph, the electric telegraph. And you can see the wire at the top. During the actual uprising, the telegraph between Lucknow and Cawnpore was cut, and parts of it were actually used. The copper wire was useful, sort of firing in cannons. So it was vital for the British to re-establish this as soon as they got back to Lucknow, and to establish communications with Cawnpore again, which was the British cantonment. And you can see a discarded cannon in the bottom left-hand corner. Next, please. And I thought we'd have something fairly peaceful to finish with, since we've been talking about so much bloodshed and bodies and everything. And this is the Alambagh down to the south of Lucknow, and it shows the grave of General Havelock, who was one of the people who actually, he tried 3 times to enter Lucknow to relieve it. During September 1857, he finally succeeded and he marched in and was able to at least get into the residency. But very sadly, he died from dysentery on the, I think it was the 24th of November. And so his body was taken back to the Alambagh, which was the British base, and buried there. And he is still there. Later on, the family erected quite a substantial memorial above his grave. But this was painted in 1864. And as I said, it's a peaceful scene to finish on. Next, please. Last slide. Thank you. So the book, well, the answer is I don't know when it's going to be out. It's published by HarperCollins, and it's part of a series looking at other battles in India, including Kohima, Cawnpore, Plassey, and I think 1 or 2 others. So it's just part of a series. It's not a standalone book. And Mehru asked earlier on what I could say new about Lucknow. And this is interesting because we were given a fairly clear brief. And for the first time, I was able to look at Lucknow from a military point of view, which obviously I hadn't done before. I'm not really a military historian. I seem to be unique in being one of the few women to talk about the uprising in military terms. So there we are. And it's interesting because when we walk around the residency, for example, we sort of go up a slight incline and we walk around and we look at the museum and that kind of thing. But we don't realize its strategic position unless you're actually defending it. And then you see how how important this incline is, and overlooking the river. So I've learned a huge amount in doing this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Hemantji, what do you suggest should we take some questions for Rosie before moving to General Naidu, or should we get General Naidu to? What do you want to do?
I think HK is muted.
Yes,
Carry on with General Naidu, that would be very nice.
okay. And then questions to both of them, right?
Right.
So, General Saab, this is a fabulous book which I have from you. It is so readable. Would you like to answer the question I asked both of you earlier? If there are more reasons for people to go to battle apart from religion.
Do you want to go first, General Saab?
Uh,
Are we
General Naidu, sir?
I don't see him.
Perhaps he's dropped out. Shall I answer briefly?
Yes,
and then,
please. Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Okay, yes, there are certainly more reasons than religion. In fact, the interesting thing about 1857, and not just in Lucknow, was that all religions came together, both Muslims and Hindus, and one of them actually said, we are different faiths, but we are all one in opposing the British. And one of the questions that's just popped up in the chat box is, were the parties involved? And the answer is yes. Now, these were people who were particularly skilled with bows and arrows, and you might think, what place, sorry, what place do bows and arrows have? But in fact, they were extremely useful. They would stand on the parapets of the buildings and fire arrows down at the British and the Gurkhas. Sorry, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, you can, is that all you want to say, Rosie, or?
That's all I want to say for the moment.
Okay, good. So General Naidu, the question was, while reading Nizam-e-Bhopal, I discovered there were so many multiple reasons for the people, for the rulers in Bhopal to go to war with neighbors, within the family, and religion was not really one of an important reason that these people waged wars. What do you think? What are the other reasons that people go to battle over?
Well, ma'am, good evening. Good evening, everyone who's all watching and listening in. And I'm sorry, last time my mic was not unmuted, but control had taken over, so they had to unmute me. Anyway, now, ma'am, actually, come to think of it, as one would say, this question is out of the syllabus, in the sense that these issues are common to all wars and battles,
right,
and is not peculiar to Bhopal. And usually in the olden days, it used to be for territory, which in turn implied economic benefit, in the sense whether it was land to get the revenue, or it was certain resources at that point of time, and so on and so forth. So even now, when the battles are fought or people going for war, the basic underlying principle is that economic. The mode may vary, the type of strife that takes place will differ, but all the same, basically is for power which comes through economic might. And in Bhopal's case of Bhopal also, this was a very common feature. And they would always negotiate in the sense, either they would go to war or settle down for certain go for certain kind of, they would offer their son as a hostage. It happened with Dost Muhammad. He gave his son as a hostage to Nizaam of Hyderabad. And after he was given as his son, and when Yar Muhammad actually died, he was sent back by the Nizaam. And when he came back with an escort from Nizaam, then they appointed him as the next Nawab. So these issues are common, and they run through the entire today's war in Afghanistan and other places. It's the same story. Actually speaking, for resources, there it is. Everywhere it is the resources, which is it turns into economic might. Economic might sometimes translates into territory. So this is what, it was nothing new.
So that is the reason of going to war even today, right?
Yeah.
Now, in this fascinating book, which you've written about the militaries of Bhopal, you cover a long period from Raja Bhoj in the 12th century to present times. Now, what inspired you to research and to work on this very interesting topic, and which is now a very, very readable book?
The basic idea was germinated into my mind by one Mr. Upadhyay, a family friend, and he is a retired IAS officer, and he is also the convener of Madhya Pradesh chapter of the INTAC. He's the one who suggested to me that there's nothing on militaries of Bhopal, and he suggested that I should write on militaries of Bhopal. I never took the bait. I knew that what I knew is that Bhopal army has not done anything much to write home about. So that's why I wanted to avoid it. But all the same, he prevailed. After several sessions of good whiskey in the evenings, and finally I decided to hold the cab. Then when I went to Delhi to check on what is available, I found that most of the records which the Britishers had maintained regarding the state forces, they have all been taken to London and they are in the archives. But I was very fortunate to come across squadron leader Chinna in the USI, who is an expert on the history of Indian Army. And he was the one who coordinated the Indian effort for centenary celebrations of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the one who sort of advised me as to where to look for what book and which library. And he also said that he will help me with the documents from London if that be the case. So I said, okay, then I hunted around for those books, managed to get some material, came back to Bhopal. In Bhopal, I was told that all records which are available in the archives, national and state archives, they are all in Urdu or Farsi. Farsi till about 1930, thereafter Urdu. So this was the second obstacle that I had to cross. I was very fortunate to come across Mr. Kaleem Akhtar, who helped me as an interpreter. He was also helping me as a guide, and he was very knowledgeable about Bhopal. He had a lot of stories to tell me, like a good Bhopali, and he also was very enthusiastic. In fact, a very senior man. He was a graduate of 1963 vintage. And he decided to take me along, and in fact, he pestered me to come along. And we worked together for a very long time in the archives. And finally, we managed to get hold of everything what we wanted to. Now, based on this, we started writing the thing. Then I realized that if I start midway, which I wanted to actually, the story didn't seem complete. And I was also aware that writing purely military history will be very dry, a very dry subject. and therefore not very many takers will be there to read it. So that's why I decided to inject certain things which made it more interesting and also rounded up the narrative. So I went right from Raja Bhoj, which gives out how Bhopal came into being, what is the genesis of Bhopal and how it developed, and what all was the role of the royal family, that is the Nawabs, and how they managed to come and make this a modern. This was supposed to be one of the most best administered state in the country, amongst all the other countries, amongst the princely states. And not only that, they were entitled to 19 gun salute. Of course, that was more because of the way the Nawab handled the or the uprising of 1857. I've called it uprising of 1857 to be politically correct. So my point is that it was because of that I decided to cover that entire period. And when I came to 47, this was again a time when I wanted to cut. But then I realized that there was something very important and very relevant to go through even right up to 1971. So I decided to do that.
Exactly. So thanks to that glass of whiskey that this book got written. Actually, it is so readable. I love the language, which is, you know, every person's language, and it's not technical at all. And the history adds to the color and information about the militaries of that state. Now, also what is fascinating about Bhopal is the series of female rulers who continuously for nearly 2 centuries were ruling the state, but also reforming administration. I mean, this is so commendable. The way administration, actually the army, or you know, the fighters of Dost Muhammad were actually, it was a ragtag group of people who would fight rival tribals and neighboring warriors. It wasn't a full-fledged army, but it became a full-fledged army also because of the very capable female rulers. So how do you look at the role of the women rulers in the 19th century?
Well, it is a very surprising thing, but most of the women of the royal family, they were very bold. In fact, I'll just give you some examples in which you will discern as to how they manage things. Now, for example, Mamola Bai. This Mamola Bai was the wife of Yar Muhammad, and she was a Hindu princess, and she never changed her name. She adapted Islam, but never changed her name. When Yar Muhammad died, she became, or during his time only, she had become a de facto regent, and she was controlling the administrative affairs. And look at her vision. She was a ruler, a de facto ruler for good about 50 years. Look at her vision. Look at the vision, because she was the one who laid the foundation of the Bhopal township. She was the one who laid the foundation for the treaty to be signed by the British, which happened good about 3 Nawabs down. But it happened because of the way Mamola Bai treated General Godard's troops who were going from Bengal presidency to Bombay presidency, and they were en route when they were taken in to Bhopal estate in the Raisian fort. They were housed, they were given rations, they were replenished from all angles and then sent forward. And that is the time he was exhausted, having traveled through the central India forest, and he really required some rest. and they were very grateful for this gesture. Although, mind you, the entire royal family was against Mongolabai, but she, as a lady alone, managed to hold them off. And that is how it happened. Now came next Sikandar Begum, Qudsiya Begum. Qudsiya Begum was a different sort altogether. She used to look after the welfare of the citizen, and she would have her evening meals only after it was confirmed to her that everyone in Bhopal has had the meal.
Yeah, wonderful.
That is the evening meal. And she had that vision. She established waterworks, and there was piped water to the communities in 1833. Thereafter, she decided, okay, now is the time we should go in for railways. She gave a personal fortune, part of this personal fortune, for construction of the railways, because at that point of time, it was done by the East India Company. Till 1857, it was the East India Company. So it was, they wanted funds, they wanted some kind of agreement where they would get some profit subsequently and all that. So all this was done by this Qudsiya Begum. Her daughter Sikandar Begum was the Nawab during 1857. She was still not the Nawab, she was the regent. But the first thing she did was to reform the army. That the payment to the army personnel was to now come from the treasury and not from the landlords. Those days the system was that depending on the size of the estate those landlords had, and the number of people they had, they were told, okay, send so many people. So they had to send people who were paid, who had the wherewithal. All the weapons, the horses, everything was that of the landlord, and they used to come, and then they used to form part of that army. Now, she said, no, payment will be from the treasury so that they are more loyal to the state. And she changed the system. She introduced selection of people for joining, she introduced selection of people for promotion, and so on and so forth. So she was again a visionary who, in her own right, she managed to maintain the army. And fortunately, she took over 4 years before the uprising, and therefore she could handle the uprising in a different manner other than what perhaps someone else had done. There were very close examples of Sindhyas in Gwalior and Holkars in Indore and Bhonsles in Nagpur, and how they managed to handle. She was different, and she managed to handle it differently.
So was it Qudsiya Begum who got a letter from the Rani of Jhansi saying you're befriending the British, and once I'm through with the British in Awadh, I'm going to deal with you? And then she wrote back. Maybe you would like to explain that incident.
It was not Qudsiya Begum. It was her daughter Sikandar Begum.
Okay.
Now, what happened with Sikandar Begum was she was widowed at the age of 19. And she summoned everyone. They had the prayer ceremony kind of a thing. And that event, all the bigwigs were summoned. And she, at the end of it, she walked to the center of the meeting and she unveiled herself. After unveiling herself, she read out the will of the Nawab, who had died in an accident. Now she read out the will and she said, my daughter is going to be the Nawab when she comes of age and she marries. And she should marry within the family so that that child becomes the Nawab, the husband becomes the Nawab. And meanwhile, I'll be the regent. Any objections, anyone? So no one had objections, and more so because the major strength, the people who were the strength of that rulers at that point of time, there were 4 of them. One included the Bourbon. Bourbons were a French family. They were supposed to be related to the King Louis of France. So they had come and sought shelter in Bhopal. They had started from Delhi, Gwalior. Finally, one branch of one of the sons had come to Bhopal and they were given shelter. In Bhopal, they managed to establish themselves as very loyal to the house, and they were one of the 4 pillars on which the Nawabs were confident about themselves. So yes, when the uprising took place, at the time Rani Jhansi said, look here, you are helping the British, or you are sheltering them, either not helping the British, you're sheltering them. You don't do it, and I will otherwise come with my sword and sort you out at the point of sword at the end of it. She said, you're most welcome. We have guns and cannons for you to greet you. So that is how it transpired.
So these female rulers of Bhopal, they seem to be born leaders, you know, encouraged by the men around them. In comparison, Rosie, we have the most well-known, famous rebel leader in Begum Hazrat Mahal. But she, do you think it was coincidence, circumstances that put her in the forefront of this fight against the British, unlike the female rulers of Bhopal who were there, you know, not by accident, it seemed, but they were there. They were there like any male ruler.
No, the issue was that they were all well read. They knew Persian, they knew Arabic, and they could also naturally converse in Urdu, which was the lingua franca at that point of time. So they were very well learned, and all of them had written their biographies. And secondly, they had a vision, all of them. Now, for example, can you imagine in Bhopal, they had established a military school in 1901. There were no takers. So finally, they had to shut down the school in 1904 because no one was subscribing to it. They didn't find people to come. I think it was much before time that military school was opened. She also opened a school for girls. She also opened a school for people, for children of the landlord, so that they could be groomed to take on the affairs of the state when they grow up. Now, all these were not very popular at that point of time because people had their own method of teaching their progeny as to how to go about things. And they were more concerned about sword fighting and horse riding and some hunting and things like this. But these people were intellectual. They had their own vision and they were very strong. They didn't bend when the male counterparts or male relatives wanted to put pressure on them. It was most unlike the normal makeup of Indian women who are quite docile that way comparatively. So they were very, very strong women, and they all of them were adept in sword fighting, shooting, whether by bow and arrow or later on by guns, and they could ride well, and they were well versed in the affairs of the state. They were scientific.
Fantastic women. But I would like to ask Rosie, you know, is there any comparison between the female rulers of Bhopal and I can only think of Begum Hazrat Mahal? Were there other female politicians in Awadh? What do you think is the similarities and the differences between?
To my mind, I think it's very difficult to compare oranges and apples. So the Hazrat Mahal and the other ladies in the court of Lucknow had a different role, and they accepted that role. Here, somehow, because of fate, all the ladies seem to have come into the ruling lineup. And it was not that there were any other contenders. It was just the lineup which was there. There were no gent heirs. And therefore, perforce they had to make the ladies and Nawabs. Of course, before that, Mamula Bai and Kuchia Begum both were regents. But subsequently, when Sikandar Begum handled the uprising very well, and she had sort of gained some brownie points with the Britishers, she made a claim for the throne. She said, look here, I should have been the Nawab, you didn't make me the Nawab. And it is very interesting, her daughter was the only one person in the world who has abdicated from the throne twice. Once for the mother and the second time for her son. So that is also a very unique thing as Bhopal is concerned, because that particular time, the Sultan Jan Begum abdicated twice. She gave up her thing for Shah Jahan Begum, and she also gave up her throne for Hamidullah Khan, who was the last Nawab.
So before I ask you the next question, General, let's find out from Rosie what she has to say about the female politicians in the forefront in the state of Awadh.
Well, I have to say that General Naidu is absolutely correct. You can't really compare the situation in Lucknow or Bhopal. It's just by chance we're talking about them together at this session. As I said, Begum Hasrat Mahal, she was actually a divorced wife of Wajid Ali Shah. He'd left her behind in Lucknow when he went off to Calcutta. And she was one of quite a large number of divorced wives. And the reason she was divorced was Wajid Ali Shah's mother thought she wasn't of suitably high status for her son. As I said, she was the daughter of an African slave, and we don't know where her father came from. And she started off as a pari, one of the fairies, if you like to call them, in the pari khana. She was good at dancing. She was good at singing. And when she was taken into the royal palace, she gave birth to a son, Burgess Khadr, which elevated her. So she becomes a Mahal. But as I say, she was one of a number of divorced women. And the reason that she was selected was purely through her son. The people opposing the company wanted a figurehead, and that was Burgess Khadr, and he wasn't their first choice. So reluctantly, she agreed to have him crowned, and he was crowned in the White Baradari in the middle of Kaiserbagh. But you can't really compare them. There were no other female politicians. We don't know the names of any other women who actually supported the Begum. We know the names of Wajid Ali Shah's wives, obviously, but we can't find any connection between them that they would have come forward and supported her. She was very much a lone figure dealing with men.
So if Burgess Khadr wasn't the first choice as the leader of the rebels, who was the first choice?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch you. Could you say again?
Rosie, you said Burgess Khadr wasn't the first choice
No,
so who was the first choice?
The first choice was the first son of Wajid Ali Shah from his wife Khas Mahal. And unfortunately, he was born disabled. He couldn't speak. His mother simply wouldn't let him be put forward. He was disabled. It was a very sad story. So Burgess Khadr was the next choice, who, obviously was fine, absolutely fine.
Before I go back to the general again, Rosie, do you know if Wajid Ali Shah he left Lucknow 1 year before the uprising? And do you know when the uprising started, or on the eve of the uprising, was he sending any advice from Calcutta? Did he have any views on how to conduct the war against the British?
No, what's interesting is that by this time he was in Calcutta, and he actually wrote to the Governor General saying he supported what the company were doing and did they want any help? Because if so, if they let him out of Fort William, if they released him, he'd get his own army together to support the company. Now, he may just have been saying that to the British. He may have been saying other things privately, but we have no proof. We only have his letters to the company saying, I support you and I really don't support the Begum at all. She's a wicked woman. Look what she's done to my reputation. So it's twisted, if you like. History is never as simple as we think.
No, no, it isn't. So let's go back to the general and find out very interesting information, how Bhopal came to participate in the First World War. That is so interesting, especially in times when it was almost taboo to cross the 7 seas. How did that happen?
One thing is what the troops that participated in First World War as the Bhopal Forces, they were 9th Bhopal Battalion. Now, 9th Bhopal Battalion was purely, though called Bhopal Battalion, but it was handled by the British. It was part of the British Indian Army. So firstly, their training and their mental makeup was different. They were certainly the elite as far as Bhopal forces were concerned. So Bhopal basically had 3 kinds of forces. One was with the British, that was part of the 1818 treaty. The second was Bhopal state forces. Subsequently, they qualified it by saying, the Britishers qualified it by saying that they'll have a lien on the second rung, which if required, they'll be summoned for service. And the third one was purely Bhopal state forces, which were meant for guarding as bodyguards, guards of forts and things like this. So there were basically 3 tiers of forces. So what went to war was the number 1 tier. And they were trained purely on the British line. Therefore, I think this concept of crossing the 7 seas never mattered much. And for them, British officers were their Maiba. Whatever they said and whatever they ordered was taken as gospel. And the troops went about with that. And just imagine in the First World War, a Sepoy, Chatta Singh, was awarded the Victoria Cross in Mesopotamia of 9th Bhopal Battalion. He was awarded because he went and saved his commanding officer who was under fire, who was wounded. And it was totally in the open, and he went, he protected the body of the commanding officer by lying down in such a manner, firstly making an entrenching, one small little trench with an entrenching tool, and then he laid himself in such a manner that no bullet could have hit the commanding officer. And the commanding officer could only be evacuated after it was dark. So he was evacuated, and for this, he was given the Victoria Cross. Of course, fortunately, he didn't get wounded. He lived to become a Havaldar, and finally, even when independence took place, he was very much alive. So my point is that they had a different yardstick as to how they treated the British officers. British officers were next to God as far as they were concerned. And it's very clearly given out. It comes out that they said, okay, because you have taught us everything, starting from playing games, how to behave, how to fight, how to conduct oneself. So everything was taught to them because they were rustic villagers. When they came, everything was taught to them by the British officers, and therefore they were very, very grateful to them. And whatever they ordered, it was done. So that was one thing. And just imagine, they went to war. What went from Karachi, they had taken off by ships, 2 ships, and they were about 1,000 strong, including the camp followers. When they came back, there was only one officer and 15 other landed back in Bombay. This was at the end of the First World War. So they imagine the number of casualties they had. Imagine the number of people they had to take in as reinforcement. And they kept fighting France, thereafter in Mesopotamia. And did a fine job. In fact, there's a hill near Istanbul, which is known as Bhopal Hill. So because they're very.
So talking about Karachi reminds me of something else which is most interesting. Like after the Second World War, the Bhopal Battalion went to Pakistan, facing Indian forces in 47, 48 war, 65, and also in 71. What was the reaction when these battles were going on of the people in Bhopal?
Frankly, even I didn't know that what they did in 1947, then 65 and 71. It is only, in fact, when I went into researching the book, that is the time I found out what exactly they had done. And I'm sure people in Bhopal had no clues. They still have no clues as to what this force which had gone to Pakistan has done anything. And whether they fought against India, firstly, they are not bothered, and whether it fought against India or not. Now, interestingly, 47, 48, there was a Battle of Chunj, which they did a very fine job, which I have mentioned in detail. Thereafter, they did a very fine job in 1965. So much so that General Harbakh Singh has mentioned in his book, War Dispatches, which he talks of 1965 operation, about this particular action in Barki, and he talks of this officer having delayed the advance for some time. So that was one very good. In any case, he was honored by giving him a Nishane Haider. And Nishane Haider, they consider a step above Victoria Cross, step above Paramveer Chakra, because they feel that is only given to people who have died in action. And so far, they have given only 11 Nishane Haidars to anyone there. So they feel Nishane Haider is a very big thing, bigger than Victoria Cross also. So what I mean to say is, Bhopal people had no idea that something like this 17. Firstly, they had changed the name by then the designation of this battalion, which had gone as 4th Battalion, the 16th Punjab Regiment to Pakistan. They had changed the name to 17 Punjab. It happened with us also. All our regiments, the original designation which was there during the Second World War, they were changed. And regrouping was done. So it has happened in India, so also in Pakistan.
So was it during one of these battles that members of the same family faced each other in war on both sides of the border, or was it not? No,
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so, because they were purely British officers at that point of time. And those who have gone, I don't think they had any roots in India, because all those people who had roots in India stayed back. The men were asked, besides the unit being sent out, the men were asked where exactly they would like to be. Most of them decided to stay back. Some of them wanted to go with the unit, and they went.
This is so interesting. Now, in your book, I also came across this remark that coexistence amongst the different communities is the hallmark of life in Bhopal, a city where you've spent your entire life. How much are the Nawabs responsible for creating this kind of harmony amongst populations belonging to different communities?
May I say with the tongue in my cheek that the Ganga Jamuni culture was conceived in Bhopal first. It was refined in Lucknow.
We
Therefore,
protest. We Lucknow walas will
Yeah.
protest.
we were resigning in Lucknow because perhaps there was no need of this culture in Bhopal, because all Bhopalis are similar, whether be of whatever denomination, they are of similar habits, similar culture. So it was really speaking, this tehzeeb was not required. And these Nawabs and Begums, what they did was, they ensured people come and populate Bhopal at the right time, when they found that there was always, because of the British treaty in 1818, their territory was defined. And once the territory was defined, there was no threat as such. So they could expand beyond the fort. And they did expand beyond the fort. They made some good colonies outside. And they wanted people to come and settle down. And those who were a little apprehensive about the security, they were put inside the fort. And space was created within the fort, where the armed forces or the army was there. They were sent out. And they were made to establish cantonments which were outside the walls of the fort. And then people were made to settle down inside the fort. And these people, so that, they felt a sense of security, and they could stay without any tension. And all artists, all intellectuals, all poets, writers, they were all invited, and they were patronized. And all of them are very fond of mushairas and all in the evening, and they would all. Another very important thing is that these people had, for two reasons, started having their meals early. It is something like in Europe. They have their dinner early. It was more also because of the Bourbon family effect, because Bourbons had come from France. As Europeans, they used to have their meals early. And then they used to go for a walk along the lakefront. Now, normally, after sundown, or when it is dark, you will find a whole lot of Bhopalis along the lakefront, going for a walk or a stroll or a drive. These days, they go for a drive. In the good old days, I suppose they used to go for a walk. So this is a recurring theme as far as Bhopal is concerned. So there was a different atmosphere and culture which was generated by the Nawabs. And there were every masjid, wherever it is made, any new building, first thing a masjid is made. After masjid, this was the olden style. Once masjid was made, alongside a Hindu temple was made. So all these places have got one masjid, one temple next to. It's very interesting to see in old Bhopal, both of them co-located. This only happens in the armed forces, where they have Sarv Dharm Sthal, which means all religions are in the same area, and one can go and worship anywhere you like. So this is something which they had started all over. So that's why there was amity. Everyone used to take part in each other's festivals and things like this. There was never any riots or intercommunal strife within the history of Bhopal, except for one blemish, Babri Masjid incident, where about 20 people died. Otherwise, there was no such upheaval in the state, whole of the state of Bhopal.
So one prays and hopes that your city always remains, the way you describe it, harmonious, and people living together, living and letting live. I know Rosie does not feel it is her job as a historian to make any predictions about the future. Yet, I cannot help asking anyone who would now like to answer this last question of mine. Is there any hope of imagining a world without armies or battles? Or is that too rhetorical?
I don't think it's possible. I wish it was, but we only have to look at the situation that's developed over the last week in Afghanistan, which is absolutely frightful. And I'm afraid this will impinge on India. I fear very much for that. But let me just go back to something a little bit more pleasant, talking about communities coming together. Wajid Ali Shah was a great man for participating in Hindu festivals. There's a lovely picture of him celebrating Basant, the spring festival, and everyone is dressed in yellow. And he's on a barge floating along the Gumpti, and all his ladies are dressed in yellow, and the elephants have yellow howdahs, and the sweet sellers are selling yellow laddus. It's an absolutely wonderful picture. So we know he participated. And also he would actually sometimes become a yogi. He would tear off his clothes, smear himself with ash, and make all his courtiers do the same as well. He was an incredibly eclectic person. And I'm very sorry that the usual picture of him is of a debauched, drunken man. In fact, he never touched alcohol. He encouraged singers, dancers, and musicians. He's a much underrated man. But I do hope that my biography of him paints a slightly different picture. And I was extremely encouraged a couple of weeks ago when I was told a Bollywood producer was interested in filming my book. And you can just see Wajid Ali Shah in a Bollywood movie, can't you? In fact, had he been born 100 years later, he would have been a film director, because he used to direct these enormous plays in the Kaisabag that would go on for weeks and weeks, and he'd organize everything, the costumes, the music, the dancing.
Indar Sabha.
Yes, absolutely. So let's see.
God. But even Satyajit Ray, I think, did not get Wajid Ali Shah right in Shatranj Ke Khiladi.
No, he didn't. It was a brilliant film, but it was based on a short story by Prem Chand. And Ray did a huge amount of research. He actually bought old costumes and that kind of thing and made sure where he was filming. But yes, I mean, he did sort of portray Wajid Ali Shah as a sort of voluptuous man. Mind you, you have to be pretty voluptuous to marry over 300 women. But there you go.
Oh, yes, but I mean, Wajid Ali Shah, I think, is one of the most underrated personalities, not only of Awadh, but of the country and in the world. He was such a fine artist. He wrote so many books, over 50 books. So I think we will not contest the Ganga Jamni way of life, whether it was Bhopal or Lucknow. I mean, as long as we practice the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, let anybody take the credit, you know, where it started, because it's such a wonderful way of living together. So can we, Hemantji, take questions from the audience now?
Okay, we have about 10 minutes.
Yes.
One question was asked by Dr. Azam Gill from France on the Facebook, not here.
Yeah.
But that has already been answered. It was about the Satyajit Ray and Shatranj Ke Khiladi. There is a question which has come, which is to anybody actually, and it says that is there a lesson to take that Lucknow also should not have fought, because Wajid Ali Shah was already in Kolkata and he did not want his Lucknow destroyed. But in the bargain, Lucknow did get destroyed and Bhopal was saved. Alongside, actually, Bhopal, Sikandar Begum was so strong, the moment fatwas will come and would be pasted on the wall, she would ensure they are removed. But the question is, was that a better start, a better thing to do, or the liberation movement which started from 1857, was that a better thing for India as such? Dr. Rosie, and one question for General Naidu, tell us something about the clans which came from Pashtuns and who ruled. And we know they fight a lot, but these two questions.
Well, if you'd like me to go ahead first. Yes, I mean, the difference between Bhopal and Lucknow was that Bhopal actually went along with the company. But you've got to remember in Lucknow that the company had actually annexed Awadh in 1856. And this, I think, had an awful lot to do with the uprising that followed in the next year. There's no doubt about that. The company had actually taken it over. And there was a lot of discontent because the company was trying to reassess the land revenue. So the Taluqdars, who were a very powerful force, actually found themselves having to pay much more, and in some cases having their land taken away. Now, whether you see what happened in Lucknow as the beginning of the War of Liberation, I would probably argue with that, because if you look at the whole of northern India during 1857, there were a number of different reasons why rebellion, the uprising, whatever you call it, broke out. Bahadur Shah Zafar was reduced to being just the king of Delhi. The Rani of Jhansi was dispossessed because her child could not succeed. There were lots of domestic reasons which came together. I think I would argue that it wasn't really the start of the liberation. I think that happened much later, during the 20s and the 30s.
Will Naidu say something about the clans?
Yes, actually, this was the clan which was, Dost Muhammad was the original guy who brought it to India. He actually, he was the scion of one of the Orakzai families. It's a small clan in Afghanistan, and he was groomed to be the next clan chief. He was betrothed to some lady, and that lady from the other clan, which was a sub-clan. They have a whole lot of clans and sub-clans. And this particular sub-clan was decided that this Dost Muhammad is too rustic, and he should not be marrying him, marrying this. So they decided to marry her to another cousin. When the marriage was fixed up, he went there, Dost Muhammad killed that fellow, and thereafter he ran away with the lady. But somehow their own clan, Orakzai clan, was not very happy, and because there the enmity continues for generation. It's not just for years or days, it continues for generations. And they decided that he should run away from there. So he decided to come to India. And there he had heard a lot about India, the riches in India and the scope, the potential of India where he could grow. So he basically came to serve Aurangzeb's darbar, where he could earn some money and some status. He did get the status, and so much so that Aurangzeb decided to send him to Malwa. While he was coming to Malwa, basically those days also central India was having a lot of forests, and because of the forest, there were a lot of dacoits. Subsequently, they were known as Pindaris, and these Pindaris were the ones who would loot the traders and things like this. And Madhya Pradesh being at the crossroad of trade and culture because of being the center, there was a lot of scope for this. So he was sent to take care of central India. While he was coming, on the way, they got news that Aurangzeb has conquered off. After Aurangzeb died, there was free for all. There were a whole lot of battles taking place in and around Delhi, and he decided to strike on his own. He decided to become a mercenary. So he became a mercenary. And basically, he got hold of Bhopal because he was a mercenary. He was invited by the Gond Rani Kamlapati, whose husband was killed, husband, a Gond called Nizaam Shah, was killed by his cousin in treachery. He was poisoned. She wanted revenge. She requisitioned services of Dost Muhammad. Dost Muhammad at that point of time had about 50 odd Afghanis with him from his own clan. Other than he gathered people, and there were 50 odd from basically from Afghanistan. So he could rely on those 50 people. Now, when they came to, they decided that they came to Bhopal. At that point, they had a deal. 50,000 rupees was the so-called supari. He killed the cousin, and thereafter he was given 25,000 rupees in cash and the village of Bhopal as part of the payment. Those days, Bhopal were pretty prosperous as a village, and therefore he got hold of Bhopal. When Rani Kamlapati died, he took over the throne because he decided that there is no direct descendant, and therefore he is the Nawab, and he declared himself a Nawab. That is how Bhopal state was established. So basically,
Naidu sir, can I come in?
Beg your pardon?
Can I come in for a minute?
Yes.
Actually, we had booked for about 2 hours. So we have about 6 minutes to go. So once you finish, I'll request Mehru ji to sum up her moderation bit, and then I'll thank everybody. First, you sum up, sir. Naidu, sir.
Okay. So my point is that the clan was basically Orakzai, but subsequently that they got hold of more people from outside. And there were a whole lot of clans like Durrani, Khel, there were certain other clans which also came into Bhopal. They were all known as Baru Khat clan, Baru Khat people, because they had to clear out the sarkandas in order to make their dwellings. And that was known in the local language known as Baru Khat, Baru. So Baru Khat means they cut the Baru. So that is how they are, still in Bhopal, they are known as Baru Khat. So that is all I have to say about Afghanis.
Okay. We have managed some more time. So we are not in really a great hurry. So there are more questions. There was one from Vijay Vijayan, and there was a question from Richa Bihari ji about who else apart from the Cloud Martin is a known European personality as far as Lucknow is concerned. And Vijay Vijayan was asking that is the fish taken as a symbol because it was the Matsya avatar of Lord Vishnu. So these two questions have emerged. And after those questions are answered, I'll request Mehru ji to close, and then I will issue the thanks. Thank you.
Right, if you'd like me to answer those questions, first of all, no, I've never found any connection between the fish and the god I think you mentioned. As far as we can tell, and this seems pretty authentic, the fish symbol in Lucknow, and I think probably also in Bhopal, is purely the Mughal award of the 2 silver fish hanging from a pole. And it wasn't just Lucknow and Bhopal. I've also seen the same thing in Gwalior, in the palace. There were fish symbols there. It was an award, if you like. It was something like the Victoria Cross, so not necessarily given for gallantry, but it was in recognition of the Nawab's status. So that's all it was. And were there other Europeans in Lucknow apart from Claude Martin? Yes. Where do we start? Claude Martin was one of the most influential, and he was certainly the richest, but there were a huge number of Europeans because Lucknow in particular was the capital of such a rich kingdom. People flocked to try and make money. There were all the artists. There was Johann Zoffany, there were the Hodges, there were the Daniels, and people came along to try and get commissions from the Nawabs and their wealthy courtiers to paint pictures, which is why we've got the Lucknow School of Painting, which is very important. And then people came along to try and sell things to the Nawabs, who, it has to be said, were quite gullible. One of my favorite figures is the so-called Barber of Lucknow, George de Russet, who was a fairly humble man who's working as a hairdresser in London, gets himself to Calcutta, and he's invited to go up to Lucknow to curl the hair of Nawab Nasruddin Haider, who had very, very straight hair, but the barber, de Russet, was able to curl the Nawab's hair. And he then more or less took over the running of the court. He was in charge of the king's wardrobe, of the king's ships, of the king's gardens. He made a huge amount of money. And he used to present his bills to the Nawab, which were sort of rolled up pieces of paper. They'd unroll them. And when the Nawab was drunk, as he often was, they'd get him to sign the bills. So the Europeans made a huge amount of money. And I have to say that many of them actually exploited the Nawabs quite shamefully, and even Claude Martin to some extent. But look at the legacy that Martin has left us with, those marvelous schools. We can forgive him a lot. Thank you.
And Rosie, there's the Vilayati Begum, the wife, the European wife of Ghaziuddin Haider, and for her, he built this fabulous English-style garden, which still exists, although not as a garden, but remnants of that garden still exist. So this was a European lady Ghaziuddin Haider had married, and she was called Vilayati Begum.
Yes, that's right. In fact, we think that she was half Armenian. But yes, I mean, the garden was obviously named after a foreign wife, no doubt about it. Though there weren't many instances of European women being married into the Nawabi family, not many at all. But it's a very eclectic area. And if we just think about the architecture, which we haven't discussed at all, the reason that it's so eclectic is that the Nawabs would bring in architects from more or less all over the world, certainly from Iraq, which is why we've got the Kabbalah and other Iraqi-inspired buildings. And there was a whole little section of Iraqi workmen there. We've already talked about the Africans who came in, many of them for the Nawab's regiment. It was called the Habshi platoon, the black platoon. So we know that Africans were there too, and the Europeans. So it was a kind of glorious mix. I'd like to ask General Naidu something about the architecture of Bhopal, because I haven't been there. Is it as striking as that of Lucknow?
Very grand, yeah.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
General?
Yes.
General?
No, my point which I wanted to convey is that leadership matters, and leadership matters even today. If the leaders are up to it and good enough, the men will follow you to eternity. And that is what actually makes all the difference. And there's no doubt the Britishers did set an example. Actually speaking, they have set standards for the rest of us in the Indian Army and the Indian Armed Forces to follow, which we are doing. And that is how you find that the leadership, especially within the armed forces, is A-class, is tops. And they have been, despite all the adversaries they faced, they have been coming out trumps every time against any battle anywhere.
Mehru I will just read a comment from Bela Sood, which is to everyone. Then I'll ask you to sum up.
Yeah.
Bela says, my comment is that history ought to teach us lessons. We don't learn and repeat same mistakes. Colonialism is well and alive as we watch new world powers emerge. Do we have a sense of rulers and leaders? What are the good qualities, strategic or just or self-serving or visionary? Do current leaders study these models, and should they be encouraged too? But I would say it is a huge debate by itself. So today, Belaji, we will not delve into this. I'm sure this point would be taken. And somebody has also mentioned about the women's emancipation, and to see so much was being done by the women during those times, so which is very heartening. Even today, we find that there is a heated debate when girls are sort of allowed to appear in the NDA examination by the Supreme Court. With that, Mehru ji, we can move towards our ending our session gradually.
Ji, I want to add to what Bela says. I want to say, I wish, I hope, I pray that our politicians, our community leaders were better educated, that they would read more, that they would show more interest in knowing where we come from, where humanity comes from, and then I think we would have a more lovable Nizaam, a more harmonious society. So that is what I want to say to Bela's comment. And also, I was reminded of Rakhi today as I was listening to the general talk about the founding of the state of Bhopal with Dost Muhammad. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Rani Kamlapati had made, she was his Rakhi sister to Dost Muhammad. So this is such a wonderful story to end our lovely evening. I feel so enlightened. I feel so great listening to Rosie and to General Naidu, and having read General Naidu's book, and looking forward to Rosie's book now. I would like to thank both of you. Keep writing, keep talking to us. So if not our politicians, at least we continue to be educated by people like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mehru Jaffer. What can I say? I think it was a most wonderful session. This kind of research is amazing. And house was full throughout, and questions were coming, and we have not lost attendance, even we have exceeded 90 minutes. I'm sure there are many lessons to take from these books and our discussion. They may be geopolitical in nature. They may be military in nature. There are many things which have not been touched, like the reorganization of the Bhopal army. It led to so many reorganizations. Even Indian Army today is moving ahead with reorganization. So with every experience, it becomes so very important, and your response has to be very fast. So I'm also sure that these two great cities will re-emerge as the top-notch cities of the world, not India. Like Lucknow was when exodus from there, Delhi was there from Delhi. Of course, they are the great cultural centers. And there is so much of depth in them. So that is one thing we take from here. Rosie, those photographs were fascinating. They take us closer as to what kind of devastation which took place in Lucknow, and much of it has been rebuilt. So thank you so much for your research, and we are very glad to know that your next book is encompassing much more than Lucknow. So on behalf of Military Literature and Cultural Festival Foundation, our mentor, Colonel Sharad Awasthi, I thank all of you for attending this session. Our profound gratitude to our guest speakers, and thanks to everybody. Our last two episodes of the inaugural session are on 28th and 29th of August. These are special sessions. First one was about freedom on 15th August. This one was tending to be towards liberation. And next one on 28th, we call it the weight of sacrifice, 1971. And 29th is a way to remember. With that, we will await more books from both of you, and some more books from Mrs. Mehru Jaffer, and I'm sure many more people will get motivated to do research and write many more books. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And while we can keep chatting, we'll request everybody to disperse at their own. We can keep chatting and then we'll wind up after 5 minutes. So
Thank you so
session
much.
from now onwards, it is more like a supper night and we can be easy. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, all the participants, thank you for being with us. It was really, really inspiring and encouraging to see a house full. Thank you, Fasi, for your bingo mark, and look forward to many more sessions like this one.
Okay, we are live on Facebook, so we are closing now. Will that be okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Good
And
night.
Thank you.
uh,
Thank you.
good night.